Good afternoon. I'm Mary Bernstein, Professor of Sociology at UConn. On behalf of the Gun Violence Prevention Research Interest Group of INCHIP and my co-directors, Dr. Jennifer Deneen and Dr. Carrie Raycion from Public Policy, I would like to welcome you and thank you for attending our panel on promoting alternatives to police in schools, addressing the school to prison pipeline. You can find additional information about today's speakers and Senator Murphy's proposed bill under the resource tab at the top of the platform. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce UConn's 16th president, Dr. Thomas Katsouleas, a leading plasma scientist and engineer and author or co-author of more than 250 publications. By way of introduction, I will read a part of President Katsouleas' letter that was published on May 31st of this year in UConn Today. Referring to the killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, which focused national attention on systemic racism in the police, President Katsouleas wrote, quote, "Unfortunately, this is just one of many examples of the pain caused by systemic injustices that are present every day. Take, for example, the disproportionate rates of death by COVID-19 among African American, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples, or the discriminatory acts targeting individuals of Asian descent and foreign nationals from many countries in this pandemic. This adds to the already vulnerable experience of so many in our community, including but not limited to DACA students, LGBTQ+ individuals, and people of color who are forced to constantly question if they can engage safely in routine activities like jogging or birdwatching. As scholars, educators, and colleagues, we are uniquely positioned to reflect, learn, and act," end quote. It is in this spirit of learning from empirical data and professional experience that we bring you today's panel on understanding the impact of having police in schools and how diverting federal funding toward evidence-based services would affect marginalized students and school safety. And thus, it is my great pleasure to turn the floor over to President Katsouleas.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bernstein, and thank you all for joining us today. And a special thanks to the organizers of this event and our panelists. Today's discussion is a terrific demonstration of UConn's role in bringing together scholars, policymakers, and practitioners in responding to critical social challenges. And no challenge is more urgent than creating safe and inclusive schools in our communities. This is especially true when racial equity is, as it should be, at the forefront of the national consciousness. Today, we're going to hear about how a focus on social and emotional learning can better serve our schools than a focus on punitive law enforcement-focused discipline. The insights from today's panel can help us improve the lives of all children in school, but especially those from marginalized communities. We're very fortunate to have such a diverse array of expertise on hand today, but scholarship doesn't do much good if it never gets communicated to policymakers and the public. That's why I'm very happy that we're joined today by Senator Chris Murphy. He's a public servant who has demonstrated real commitment and leadership on these issues. I need to also take a moment to thank the Senator for all the amazing work he has done as a member of the Appropriations Committee to fight for essential COVID relief funding for all of higher education, as well as critical research programs at UConn. So thank you, Senator. The Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act, which Senator Murphy introduced this past July, would provide funding for school districts to hire counselors, social workers, and other health professionals in place of law enforcement personnel. As Senator Murphy pointed out in July, we have compelling evidence to show that a law enforcement focus doesn't make our schools safer and disproportionately singles out Black and Latino students for punishment. Bringing a dedicated and passionate lawmaker together with some of the top scholars in the field to solve these challenges is at the very heart of a public university's mission. I know there's a great deal happening in Washington right now, so it's a real testament to his dedication that he's able to join us today, even for a short time. It's my pleasure to welcome Senator Chris Murphy. Senator, please join us.
Thank you very much, President Katsouleas. Thank you for the great leadership that you bring to our flagship state university. And thank you very much to those that are bringing this panel together. I'm looking forward to listening to as much as I can and getting a readout for any portions that I'll miss. But this issue is very, very close to my heart. I sit, as the President mentioned, on the Appropriations Committee, but also on the Education Committee. And I am one of the few parents of young children in the United States Senate today. I've got a middle schooler and a third grader, both who go to a big urban school district in the public school system. I have long been active on issues related to juvenile justice and the school to prison pipeline. And I'm excited today to be able to kick off this panel by talking a little bit about the legislation I introduced now a few months ago with Representative Ayanna Pressley, bicameral legislation called the Counseling, Not Criminalization in Schools Act. A lot of my education on this issue, frankly, comes through my wife, who's sitting right around the corner from me, listening to me talk about her. She now works on school change on a national basis, but she started out representing individual kids through her work heading up the Children at Risk Unit at Connecticut Legal Services, Connecticut's legal aid organization. And one story that she brought home has stuck with me. It's the story of a young man, I think he was a 10th grader in a big Connecticut urban school system. And he had a habit at the beginning of his 10th grade year of walking out of class in the middle of class, wandering the hallways until he'd finally bump into another teacher or administrator or a school security officer who would bring him down to the principal's office. He had to end up getting suspended for a few days, sent home to his grandmother with whom he lived. This happened over and over again, September and October of his 10th grade year, such that by the end of October, he had been out of school more days than he had been in school. Finally, he was so frustrated by this sort of cycle that he ended up getting into a verbal argument with, I think it was an assistant principal during one of these sort of moments when he was walking through the halls. There was a police officer in the school, a school resource officer who was alerted to this verbal altercation and ended up getting this kid arrested for, I think, something equivalent to disorderly conduct, an argument in the hallway between him and an administrator, something that in normal cases would just end up with this kid being sent to the principal's office. Well, as it turned out, essentially, this kid didn't know how to read. He was years and years behind the rest of his peers. He was had a learning disability and was mortally embarrassed to sit in this class when he couldn't understand anything the teacher was talking about. That's why he was walking out. Luckily, he had access to a good legal aid attorney who kept him out of the court system. But this is indicative of what's happening all across our country. Kids being arrested, sent into a school to prison pipeline for ordinary misbehaviors, often connected to their disabilities or childhood traumas that they have experienced. And that one negative interaction, which ends up with an arrestable offense, often leads kids down a path from which they can never, ever return. That is just one story, but unfortunately it plays out over and over and over again, especially for students of color and especially for disabled children. In Connecticut, a pretty progressive state, if you are a Black student in a school with a school resource officer, you are 3 times more likely to be arrested than if you're going to school in a school that doesn't have an SRO. For Latino students in our state, for some reason, the number is actually 6 times. You're 6 times more likely to be arrested if you're in a school with a school resource officer. Whether we intend to do this or not, loading our schools up with police officers ends up targeting children of color, often for misbehaviors that should never, ever result in a criminal offense. And it's time for us to recognize that, well, it may make sense to us on a surface level analysis that school safety must be enhanced by police officers with guns and the power of arrest. That's not what the data tells us. The data increasingly tells us the opposite. We did a survey of schools in New Haven, and what we found out was that in New Haven, the schools with the school resource officers had higher rates of delinquent behaviors than schools without school resource officers. Why? Because they create an atmosphere that's not conducive to learning. They make students feel as if they're in a juvenile justice facility rather than a learning environment. And that ends up, unfortunately, leading to many of the behaviors that you're seeking to prevent. And so I just think it's time that we draw the line. I've introduced this legislation at the federal level, which would just say, listen, federal dollars are not going to go to put police officers in schools any longer. They're going to go instead to hire wraparound services for kids that have learning disabilities, who have traumas, who need social workers, who need school psychologists, right? Let's put the resources behind the services that actually build safe schools instead of the services that make us think that we are creating safe schools. This legislation has gotten a lot of attention, and I'll end with this. It's gotten a lot of attention in part because parents of children in white schools cannot understand why anyone wouldn't want police officers in schools. Right now, we are in the middle of a racial reckoning in this country. We are, I think, at the beginnings of a second civil rights movement. But there is no issue out there, I would argue, like the issue of police in schools, in which we have two fundamentally different conversations happening. In white schools, police officers are perceived to be there to protect the kids because, by and large, they are protecting the kids. They aren't arresting white students like is happening in schools with predominantly school populations of color. And so white parents and principals of white schools and superintendents in these largely white school districts are frankly at times furious with legislation like the bill that I introduced, because they just can't understand why anyone would have a problem with a school resource officer. Move to the conversation that's happening in our urban school districts, in our school districts of color, where the perception is not that these police officers are there to protect the kids. The perception is that those police officers are out to target the kids or to hassle them about getting information about some incident that happened on Saturday night or Sunday afternoon in their neighborhood. In these districts, parents of color and students of color are desperately asking for these school resource officers to be pulled back in order to make those neighborhoods and those schools truly safe. We have alternatives right now, as I'm sure you'll talk about. Big school districts like Denver and Minneapolis are ending their contracts with school police departments. I don't argue that you shouldn't have security in schools. You should. I just don't think there's any reason to have a security officer with a gun and the power of arrest. And so I'm really excited about helping to lead a conversation that ultimately leads to reform. Not just reform in terms of the different kind of security that we put in schools, but also reform that understands that the way you really build a safe learning environment is by building a positive school, right? A school that doesn't just render consequences on negative behaviors, but incentivizes and rewards positive behaviors. And this opportunity brought to us by the civil rights protests of the summer, and I hope by this legislation will stimulate a conversation all around the country about the kind of alternatives that you're going to discuss today. So, Tom, thank you for having me. Sandra, thank you for leading this panel, and we'll look forward to working with all of you as the rest of the year and the beginning of 2021 arrives.
Thank you, Senator Murphy, for your very thoughtful remarks, and most importantly, for your work on the bill. Your stories helped us understand what we're seeing in that bill, and we're very grateful that you could join us during this very busy time. At this time, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I'm very excited because each of them brings a very different experiences and perspectives that will help us unpack what we're seeing in that bill and what we just heard from Senator Murphy. So let's get started by introductions, if we can bring our panelists in. So first we have Stephen Hernández, who is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Commission on Women, Children, and Seniors. The commission serves as the nonpartisan arm to the Connecticut General Assembly. Second, we have Aaron Kupchik, who is a professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware, and he has written extensively on these topics. And last but not least, but we're waiting for Jihad to come to bring on his camera on. We have Leonard Jihad, who I've told is only called Leonard by his mother, so he prefers to go by Jihad. He is the executive director of the Connecticut Victim Intervention Program, which is based in New Haven. Thank you so much to each of you for your time, and let's get right in. Stephen, let's start with you. Over the past year, the Commission has been leading the statewide social and emotional learning and school climate collaborative. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned about how the current funding mechanisms shape the social, emotional, and behavioral work that's happening in schools. And how would this legislation impact capacity to support districts in their school safety and school discipline?
Well, what's interesting is that we fund our priorities. And in a lot of our districts, particularly our underperforming, or what I like to call our under-resourced districts, which run, unfortunately, in a deficit. What we find is that we have used our policing infrastructure and what we call our school resource officers to do, when successful, what we should be doing in other ways. We rely on our school resource officers to be counselors, to be role models, to be mentors. And again, this is where it's successful. Where it's not successful, unfortunately, we rely on them to be truant officers, disciplinarians, and a replacement for the vice principal. So this is a model, unfortunately, that in our districts that are most stressed has really embedded itself in the day-to-day of the young person. Senator Murphy is quite right that kids feel as if part of the school day is to be under the watchful eye of law enforcement. And that really does impact the conditions of teaching and learning, taking the school from being a place where you go to be safe to a place where you go to be watched.
Thank you, Stephen. Jihad, I saw you giving a thumbs up, so let's move to you. As a social advocate, tell us how youth experience the current system and give us a focus on equity, inclusion, and diversity. How might this proposed legislation affect the school experience?
Hi, good afternoon. And again, my name is Leonard Jihad. I'm Executive Director of Connecticut Violence Intervention Program, and we work with youth engaged in risky activity in the New Haven community. So risky activity could be gang activity, it could be shooters, anything that puts them at risk or their safety at risk in the community also. So I was talking to my outreach workers and, I was talking to them about having law enforcement in the schools and that type of thing. And, they all simply said and agreed that no one wants the police, until you need the police. And in saying that, do we need policing in schools? I talk to the kids, I talk to the school, I talk to parents, and it all goes back to one thing, it's relationship building or relationship building capacities. Now, I go back and forth to this because I have a law enforcement background. I'm a retired chief probation officer in New Haven with a specialty in working with youthful offenders and also violent offenders. And everything that we did, we built relationships. So I know police officers, I know good police officers who did a phenomenal job. I know police officers, who acted as parents, who acted as social workers, who were coaches, who even adopted some of the kids that they work with in the school. And they built relationships with the kids. And one thing that I know that they said that they hated is that they were forced to be put in that role as police. So even in the hallways, the staff would treat them like, they needed to patrol a neighborhood, like they're patrolling hallways, like they would patrol a neighborhood. And they wanted to take that stigma off of them, police only respond when something bad happens. And they wanted to be more of an advocate for, for the kids and for the youth. So they didn't want to walk up and have youth run away or walk away, when something happened. So, the SROs, they changed the role of police, in schools to school resource officers, which was good. but they didn't want to just walk up and the kids walk away. They wanted to really have a relationship with the kids and not to be used as a source like when the kids got in trouble. And part of what they did was when there was an incident, a lot of staff wanted the child punished. They wanted them arrested, and because they were like so readily accessible. But they, whenever possible, they would use alternatives like the Juvenile Review Board, like youth court, or even my program, the Street Outreach Worker Program. Just as an alternative, to having a child, getting arrested or having involvement in the court system, which we know when a child is involved in the court system, Black and brown kids are processed further within the court system, than the non-white students also. So upon retirement, just real quick, so upon retirement from adult probation, I began working in the school system as a dean. I quickly changed that role up, or the title of my role, to intervention specialist. So I didn't want to be known as a dean of discipline. And that's what I did. I initially started relationship building capacities with the kids, and my office became a hangout. Kids would come in, and the first thing I would do, I said, listen, I don't want to talk about what happened. I want you to write your name on the board in cursive. And kids aren't taught cursive at school anymore. And they said, why do I need to learn cursive? I said, because you're going to be important. You're going to need to learn to write sign autographs, and you're going to definitely have to write checks, sign checks. And so that just built a relationship, and my office became the hangout. So I would tell kids, you don't have to just come in here when you get in trouble. You can come see me and come check on me. I put the onus back upon the kids, and they would come check on me. And, again, we built a relationship. The dean of discipline became, the hangout. But one thing, when I talk to the kids about academic success and things like that, I would ask, I said, well, why do you do well in some classes and not so in other classes? And they said, because they didn't feel that the teacher cared about them, that they didn't have a relationship. So when I talked to some of the teachers, the kids were right. They did not have a relationship. And the teachers would say that my job is to teach, not to build a relationship or be their friend. And I said, but if the student is telling you that they want to build a relationship and they would do better in your class if they had a relationship with you, why can't we do that as educated professionals? And it's no different. I'm a Pop Warner football coach, and I played high school and college football. There were some coaches that I would run through fire for, and there were some coaches that, I would really go to war for. And at the end of the day, I was emotionally spent, because I gave everything I had for that coach. And so we can defund, we can use all these different methods of engaging youth and everything, but until we start really forging relationships and get to the root of the issues, that these kids are facing all the time. And we know the factors. I mean, this is just basically scratching the surface, but we know the factors. Children are coming to school hungry. Children are coming to school tired. There's no air conditioning in the house in the summertime, so they're hanging out late. There's no heat. Children didn't even have coats. So if we can address these factors and just scratch down and then, dig down deep, and even use programs that we know, evidence-based programs like cognitive behavioral therapy, which we know works, but we just don't employ it until a child gets in trouble, where we can elicit, a proper response when certain things happen. So we have our work cut out for us as educated professionals, but, we look at the data, we look at the quantitative measures and everything, and we know that having a police officer in the school doesn't really make us safer, just like having a gun in the house doesn't make us safer, but if we can just drill down, and we're all smart people. I think that's why we're picked for this panel right here. We're people that can make things happen, drill down and really, get to the root, of children's safety, the factors that lead to deviant behavior, and also policing. I'm looking for some great answers. I'm listening in, and I'm hopeful, and I'm positive we will have a positive outcome from this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your stories, certainly, because it makes the work I know that Stephen has been working on with the state collaborative, meaningful and real. It gives real meaning to the things that we've been talking about and seeing. So, Aaron, let's turn to you now and Can you share with us what you have found in your research with regard to school policing? I know Senator Murphy talked a bit on some of the issues, but can we dive a little deeper into what does the research tell us to support or contradict the idea that law enforcement in schools promotes safety? And are there differential impacts for different groups of students?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question and for the invitation to be on this terrific panel. I also appreciate the leadership of Senator Murphy on this issue because, my role is to talk about the research, and just about not just about, everything he said was spot on, is supported by a growing body of research. In terms of, there are multiple things I think at play. One is the effectiveness of SROs at promoting safety, including school shootings. The majority of quality empirical studies finds that when we control for risk factors or make suitable comparisons across schools, the presence of an SRO predicts either no differences or higher rates of student misbehavior. We know little about how to prevent school shootings in particular, thankfully, because even though they don't seem like it, they are still rare events. The most promising strategy, based on the research that we have, is to have trusted adults in the building that a student can confide in if they hear about a plan. The little research we have on this suggests that most often that's not an SRO, even when the schools have an SRO, but students tend to go to a trusted teacher, counselor, or administrator instead. So in general, there's little evidence to support the presence of SROs in promoting safety. Strategies mandated by the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act, such as trauma-informed care, social emotional learning, positive behavioral interventions and supports, are far more promising as methods of maintaining school safety. And when we have SROs in place, sometimes the policing imperative overrides those other things. Even when the police officer is taking a mentoring and caring approach, their presence adds more of a law enforcement presence to this, or mandate to the school that can impair other strategies that are more effective. In terms of how different groups of students are affected by the presence of an SRO, well, to begin with, we know that LGBTQ students, students with disabilities, and students of color, particularly Black students, are at the greatest risk of punishment in school. And we know that with an SRO present, schools tend to punish more often and more severely, including suspensions, but also when we look at arrests. It's important to keep in mind, just as the senator said, that suspensions and even arrests are most often for minor misbehaviors. Suspensions, for example, are most commonly for disruptive behavior like insubordination that doesn't put anybody in danger of harm. Arrests are most commonly for minor, subjectively perceived offenses like disorderly conduct that in years past would have meant a trip to the principal's office. Recent research using nationwide data finds that schools with SROs have higher arrest rates, particularly of Black students, than other similarly situated schools. So there do seem to be most certainly different effects across students. Another recent study that I conducted with a number of co-authors finds that while SROs all prepare for threats, they tend to view potential threats differently across school contexts and student body contexts more specifically. We find that in mostly white middle-class schools, SROs typically define threats and see threats as outsiders, people who may come to school and wish to do harm. But in schools with more low-income students and students of color, they see the students themselves as the potential threats. So the police officer's presence and definition of what they're doing can vary. In other words, research does show us again that the presence of SROs puts certain students, particularly Black students, at the greatest risk of negative outcomes that can follow them for a lifetime. We need to see policing as a response, not as a response to a lack of safety, but as part of a broader social control agenda. And schools are safe overall, safer than they've been in a long time nationally. There are pockets there are certainly schools with problems with misbehavior and crime, but nationally speaking, schools are so much safer than they used to be 25 years ago. We don't need police in the vast majority of them. SROs aren't about crime. They're about responding to anxiety and uncertainty around us, with the world and with our children. They're part of the same tendency to rely on police and punishment as a response to a broad array of social problems and anxieties. For example, we use police and the criminal justice system to respond to problems as varied as poverty and joblessness, homelessness, mental illness, and drug abuse, rather than counseling and other therapeutic services. When we do have those services, they're coupled with the justice system, like drug courts, rather than just drug treatment outside of the justice system. Racial inequality and oppression matter too. In recent research, for example, co-authors and I find that in counties in the South where corporal punishment is still used, we find that in counties where there were more lynchings during the Jim Crow era, we see greater use of corporal punishment today, particularly among Black students. The book I'm currently working on is about the links between resistance to desegregation mandated by Brown versus Board of Education and suspensions today. In other words, a legacy of racialized violence is part of what we need to think about in explaining policing and punishment in schools today. Scholars of punishment have shown for a long time we have to view policing and punishment as a response to our anxieties and our worries, particularly in areas marked by more racial oppression. And school policing is part of this trend. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introductions and getting us started with all of our panelists and your perspectives and ideas. Now we're going to dive in and unpack all of these issues a little bit more. We had the great fortune of being able to curate and get some questions in advance for the panel and be able to put them together for you. I have targets that could start by answering some of the questions, but this is a great time for each of us to jump in when you see something that is useful. And I understand that Jihad has a group of youth in the background that are doing some orientation. So every once in a while we may hear or see them popping in as well, which is just absolutely fine with all of us. So let's get started on the discussion. Stephen, you know, you've worked with a lot of CT schools, organizations, and agencies, like all over the state, because that's your job. What other supports do school systems need to truly make a shift away from policing to trauma-informed and positive social emotional foci?
Well, thank you for that. You know, in a recent conversation with the head of our superintendents, Fran Rabinowitz here in the state of Connecticut, she described the current state of the school environment as one of emotional paralysis. Now, that is very significant. And I know that she's not a clinician, nor am I, but for a practitioner who has been in a learning environment for so many years, to describe the current situation as emotional paralysis really does tell the tale. And there's another part to this story, which is an older story than COVID, and it's older than this year. And it's the traumatic experiences and emotional paralysis that children of color have experienced in our schools that are under-resourced because of crumbling infrastructures, because of a lack of resource, because of traumas that they may be experiencing because of food insecurity, because of housing insecurity, all of the things that young people bring with them to school. So when you think about the Herculean task of really taking the data that we see and addressing the data with targeted resourcing, with really focusing on what we know works, you have to start on the conditions of teaching and learning. And this isn't just the kids, this is the adults as well. You know, when you described, it was really resonant for me when you described the adult who said, I'm here to teach. And to me, to my ear, that is an adult that is not supported by leaders. That is an adult that is not supported by either their administrators or by the lack of resources to be able to see themselves beyond the instruction and in the realm of relationship. And it is those relationships that really are going to build the foundation for successful, productive people. We see the results of this lack of focus on relationships when young people from one year to the next are expected to behave like adults, either in a college environment or in a workforce environment. And we see that when you mix a little bit of freedom, a little bit of power, and a little bit of alcohol or drugs, you get a whole lot of trouble. And we see that in all of our institutions. And that's because we are not focusing enough on what I believe is the second pillar of the two pillars of the educational environment, which is our social and emotional skills building and addressing of high-level trauma so that all young people have the opportunity to learn in the conditions that are safe, welcoming, and positive.
Thank you. Jihad or Aaron, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that? I'm thinking of Jihad running his orientation right now. as one of your strategies, and the things you talked about earlier when you made that switch from dean of discipline. What were the things that you found to be helpful in making that shift? And
I just need to rewind for a moment. So before I was chief probation officer, I worked in a prison, and I was 23 years old when I started. And the culture of the prison is not to shake hands or, excuse me, not to really engage in that type of thing. And the first thing they told me was to go get yourself a gun because you're going to see these guys in the community when they get out. And so I quickly learned, and I was taught by the inmates, they said, you're a good guy, you're young, you're a nice guy, but you're a phony because you're not being yourself. You want to shake our hands. You want to go into the visiting room and, ask about our kids and things like that. And when I took their advice, again, that wasn't part of the pre-service training. When I took their advice, I learned to enjoy the job. And I worked in the prison system for 10 years, and I wrote one disciplinary report because of insulting language in 10 years. And you have some officers who write 4 or 5 per shift, because everyone can have a big day. You don't overreact, you don't panic. And again, you build relationships. So I took this and I brought it to adult probation. So I knew that the clerical staff set the tone for the visit. So when people would come, and no one wants to come to a probation office, but if someone walks in and they're engaged right there, hey, what's up? How are you doing? How are your kids doing? Good, but I have to go and get them off the bus. I'm kind of in a hurry. All right, let me let your officer know. They get them right in without waiting for an hour or that type of thing. And then everything went up. The data was improved. People started reporting more. It wasn't a more confrontational type of, office visit. And again, this is what I took into the school system. So again, normally the Dean of Discipline's office, which I changed to intervention specialist, wasn't a place where, a child would like to congregate. But again, you just put it back on them. We weren't allowed to give the kids food and things like that because of allergies. However, strategically, I would place certain foods, and if a child took it upon themselves, to grab a snack or something like that, they would take it and they were appreciative of it. They just knew where to go when they needed help. And so the good officers, the school resource officers who worked in the schools, they employed like the same type of thing. Again, they were coaches, they were mentors, and, a youth that's engaged in risky activity. I hate to say gang members and things like that because we don't have traditional gangs in New Haven. We do have some kids that are doing some bad things, but not traditional gangs. But, they don't traditionally hang out with police officers, or the school resource officers. So wherever that, they can build a relationship and have that trusting adult, that others in the panel talked about, they can do it. So I'm confident that if school resource officers, are removed, we could have those trusting adults. And, again, they can drill down because, again, you have a child who wants to do well in school, and everybody wants success, whether it's on, in academia or on a sports playing field or, even playing a video game. Everyone wants success, but if you don't have Wi-Fi at home, or you don't have a computer, to do your homework, then, you're up against a lot, and you're going to be challenged. So wherever they can get support, I think that's the biggest thing. I hope and that things can be expanded where kids can have more counselors and more social workers and, to give them the support. And really quickly, New Haven started this program called Youth Stat, where we would have school psychologists, we have nonprofits, we would have law enforcement, school officials to find out why isn't this child coming to school? Is it a clothing issue? Is it access to certain resources and things like that? And we found that not only do we have to work with the child, we also have to work with the family. But for the most part, there were things that, we could, readily take care of. The child just didn't have clean sneakers. We get them sneakers, now they're coming to school, So
Jahad, thank you very much for sharing the idea of starting from basic needs up to sense of belonging and connections. I think the big question, though, for maybe Stephen and Aaron to think about is how do we create more Jahads in the world, right? So what are the innovative strategies and programs that you've seen or heard about that can help make a mindset shift in more school personnel to go away from criminalization? And what makes those strategies effective?
May I, Stephen?
Absolutely.
Well, one of the most promising recent programs I've seen tested is simply empathy training, fostering a greater sense of empathy among school staff towards children, particularly children who come from very different backgrounds from them, who they might not have, though the staff might be well-intended, they might not have as much experience dealing with children who come from very different backgrounds. So teaching empathy is very, very helpful. Of course, there are a slew of programs. Again, I just mentioned some, they're mentioned in the bill, that have been evaluated and shown to be effective. And they all share similar strengths and they all share a lot of similarity. And that is that they seek to treat children as children who need guidance and supports, not as potential criminals, not as people who need to be kicked out of our schools. Right, the center's example earlier of a student who would leave class because he couldn't read is spot on. And I've done a lot of research in schools, and almost all the teachers I've encountered who have asked why students tend to misbehave, they tell me it's most commonly because the student doesn't understand course material. And so they want to escape a difficult environment, maybe bring positive peer attention as a class clown or what have you. So what do? We kick them out of class so they fall further behind. Now, I empathize with that teacher who's trying to teach to 35 and one is making it very difficult. But the fact that the school chooses to remove the child rather than empathize with them, rather than treat them as one of our children, and couple that punishment perhaps with tutoring, mentoring in a way that's effective, that's on us.
Stephen, do you want to add to that? Because it's certainly a topic that has been a challenge that the collaborative has been addressing.
Sure. One of the most frustrating experiences that a young person can really feel after third grade is the inability to access their own education, and that's because of literacy deficits. What we've seen with young people, and Aaron, I think you referenced this, is that when young people are frustrated by their own inability to access their education, they may be very bright, but literacy needs to be taught very intentionally. What they do is that they wander away from their educational experience, and they find other ways to project some of those frustrations. So I just want to put a plug in for early literacy as a way to help young people access their own educational experience. Aside from that, diversification. And what I mean by diversity and engagement is that it's not enough to say we need more teachers of color just because we do. It's important because young people need to see themselves and their future before them. The role modeling, the care, the connective tissue to community, to space. When adults around them model their own possibility, it's really, really meaningful for young people. And it's for all young people, but particularly children of color. So diversity is an interesting quandary because in the state of Connecticut, we've been working very hard on 5- and 10-year plans to diversify our teaching and our administering of our schools. And really, what that says to me is that there is sort of a steady habit mentality when it comes to really diversifying our schools. We need to do this a lot faster. We need to be a lot more aggressive in how it is that we hire, how it is that we promote, and how it is that we fill our institutions of teaching with a more diverse candidate pool. That is action verb work that we need to be doing now.
Aaron, I think very, very quickly, if we could follow up on your comment just a few minutes ago, in your book, Homeroom Security, you argue for something called a positive ethos in schools as promoting safer schools. Could you just quickly define for our audience what a positive ethos would look like?
Sure, thank you. So by positive ethos, I mean exactly what I was referring to in my last comment of having greater empathy for students, seeing them as cherished, as children who we cherish, who we care for. The teacher, going back again to the teacher who said, well, I'm just here to teach, not to care for these kids. That's so problematic, right? Because children see that, students see that. they interpret that as not being wanted, perhaps, or they interpret harsh discipline and over policing as being seen as threats, rather than having school having a positive ethos where they're looking at a student as being valuable and loving.
Thank you very much. I love the interconnection amongst the conversations that we're having, so that everything really, we acknowledge that safety, discipline, and social emotional well-being are really not separate things, even though we treat them that way. Believe it or not, we're actually getting close to the end of the time. So I want to do one last question as a round robin to each of our panelists in 30 seconds or less or so, or a minute or so. What role should, if any, law enforcement play in schools, and why? Because that's the crux of what we're talking about here today, right? What role should law enforcement have, if any, in schools, and why?
I'll tell you that from our perspective, the school is a microcosm of the community. But the relationships, the important relationships that I think need healing, tending to, and really deep exploration of what the expectations are the relationships between the adults and community. And what we're finding and what we see, not only across the state of Connecticut, but across the country, is those fractured relationships between people in power and people who are the subject of policing. And, police are not acting in a vacuum, whether it's in a school or it's in a community. They are working at the behest of someone. And whether it's the training that they're receiving in the institutions or it's the expectations of the community, they don't act in a vacuum, and they certainly don't act on their own. So it's important to heal those relationships between the adults and community. Insofar as what the role should be for police officers in the school, I think I want to follow Jihad's advice, which is, we'll call you when we need you. Otherwise, we've got this. And the conditions of teaching and learning belong to the leaders, the adults, and the young people who are in the school in a pro-social, positive, empathic way.
Thank you. I completely agree. I've often argued for more of a police liaison role, where there are certain a number of designated officers at precinct who know the school administrators, perhaps spend a day at the school every so often, or a few hours every so often, but it's not their beat. They're not SROs, and they're not a regular presence. But it would establish some familiarity with first responders of the school, and some familiarity of the school with the first responders. I completely agree. The problem is, there are a variety of problems that we've been discussing. And those who are more proponents of SRO programs argue that, well, if we train them properly so that they're working as mentors and counselors, then we have better outcomes. And there's certainly truth that when we train them, when they act more as mentors and counselors, the results are better than if they work strictly as law enforcement. But the results still show that their presence leads to unintended negative consequences for students, right? So that, coupled with the fact that overall the vast majority of schools are very safe, a liaison type of program where we'll call you if we need you would be much better.
This quote came from a police officer at James Hillhouse High School, who's a school resource officer. And he was telling me a story about a story that he had with a youth regarding the relationship. And the youth had told him, he says, well, let's do this together. I think that the youth had an appointment or something that they had to do. And so the SRO said, I will meet you there, and, we'll do this together. And so that was the student's idea. And so he says, I let myself down plenty times in life, but I won't let you down, so he had the team concept, that, let's do this together. And it was a police officer, they had that relationship. I just keep going back to that relationship thing. And, with my team, the Street Outreach Worker Program, we'll go to basketball games, we'll wherever the kids are, and the kids will come up to us, they'll talk to us and things like that. And the kids really who don't want part of the program, they'll, we're cool with that. But I always ask the youth, I said, when you want me to stop caring about you, you let me know. And there's never been one youth who ever said that they wanted us to stop, caring about them.
Thank you so much, Stephen, Jihad, and Aaron, for being here with us today. I think, I've certainly learned a lot from your experience, your expertise, and your stories, particularly your stories. And so I appreciate your very thoughtful comments and participation. But believe it or not, our time is just about up. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Carl Lejwe, the Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Connecticut, who will provide some closing remarks. Provost Lejwe.
Thank you. This was really a tremendous event, and I'm really pleased to have had a chance to be here. And UConn, as our state flagship university, has a real responsibility to be creating opportunities to have these exact conversations. I will say what was really striking to me was that some of the conversation was about problems with SROs within schools and talking about the differential impact for communities of color, or the ways in which data show us that SRO presence largely does not reduce violence, or the way in which this can only further foster a legacy of racialized violence. But what I was particularly struck by was how each of the panelists talked about what we should be doing, what we can be doing, the way Stephen talked about the importance of collaborations, and Jihad talked about building relationships and trust, and even talked about cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, or Aaron talking about trusted adults and the way in which we can really foster empathy and other ways to create that other environment. And I will just say, Stephen said something that I was so sure I knew what he was going to say when he was talking about the teacher who was not, basically said, I only have the responsibility of teaching. I thought he was going to say something very negative about the teacher, and I'm embarrassed to say that's where my mind went, but where he went to was, that's a teacher not supported. And that really struck me, and it was important to think about. And I just want to tell a very quick story. When I was at the University of Kansas, I was the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And right when I came in, the university was forced to allow concealed weapons on campus. And it was just as I had come in, and I had agreed to run a town hall. I am trained in clinical psychology. I do research on adolescent risk behaviors. And I thought it was important that we have this town hall. And a student raised her hand and started crying and said, what am I supposed to do when someone points a gun at me and I am trying to teach class and have difficult conversations with students? And I'm embarrassed to say I got this completely wrong. I became an administrator in that moment, and I didn't do what Aaron said in terms of building empathy. I didn't do what Jihad said in terms of building relationships. And I didn't do what Stephen talked about, which is understanding the long-term impacts of trauma. And what I did was talked about why it actually wasn't unsafe and the likelihood, and I gave data, and it just was the wrong time. And I lost that whole room that day. And I went home, and I knew I was going to do another one the next day. And I realized what I really needed to do was to do those things that each of our speakers talked about today. And I was just an honest person with them. I did what Jihad said and talked about trying to build that relationship. And that student was there again. And it turned out that student talked about having guns in her school when she was younger, via SROs, and how that had created an environment for her where she did not feel comfortable learning because she was always so scared. And now she thought the university was going to be that too. And so I really appreciate, I wish I had seen this before and I might have gotten that right the first time, but I just think the things that we've talked about here and the way that Sandy has kind of pulled this together really give us a sense of both what the senator had laid out for us in terms of the importance of tackling this issue, tackling it more quickly, as Stephen said, and taking an important stand. And I am proud that our university has been able to be a small part of that today. So I believe we're at the end, so.
I believe
you,
so.
everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Lejuez, and I believe we are all set. Thank you to all of the panelists